Komið þið sæl öll sömul, hjartanlega velkomin í Listasafn Reykjavíkur. Hello everybody, welcome to Reykjavík Art Museum. I'll switch to English now. My name is Markus Thor Andresson. I'm Chief Curator here, and we are so excited about tonight's event. We've been looking forward to it since 2019, I think it was. So, I don't have to explain to you why we've been waiting so long, but here we are, and we're very happy about it. You may be familiar with our program, the talk series. This is a collaborative project between the Reykjavík Art Museum, the University of Iceland University of the Arts, and with the Kynningarmiðstöð, Icelandic Art Center. And we all welcome you to this event. And special welcome to our guest, Anda Rottenberg. We are... Just a little something about this lady, who we are so happy to see. She comes from Varsjá, and she is visiting in this occasion of the talk series where we do a certain routine. We have this visitor going to the art university, speaking to the students there, holding a roundtable discussion there. And then there is an introduction to the art scene here, so studio visits or going to other museums or venues. And then there is this public talk here. So this is basically what we have been doing. And we've had a few of those events after COVID times, and they are slowly building up online. So you can, visit talk series of the past on our website. And about Anda. We wanted to tell you a little bit about her. She is coming from Warsaw, and she is one of those divas of contemporary art. You couldn't imagine the contemporary art scene in Europe without her. She has had a huge influence on the scene. She's been doing so many different things that it would take all evening for me to talk about it. But some highlights. She was the director of Sagitta National Art Gallery in Warsaw in the 90s to 2001. And she has been curator and commissioner of the Polish Pavilion in Venice numerous times. She was co-founder and board member of Manifesta, the European Art Biennial, that itinerant biennial. And currently, you are appointed the cultural editor of Vogue Polska magazine and author of a personal weekly radio broadcast, Andi Materia. So freelancing and doing writing, publishing books and articles and curating and everything. And we were discussing what her connection with Iceland has been in the past. And she remembered that in 1991, there was a young artist in a show with her. Haraldur was his name. So we're happy to see Haraldur with us. And they they reunited here. Very good. But tonight we have the talk that she's presenting, Long Way to Laramie, Wyoming. And just a short blurb on the talk. It's a brief description of the history of intolerance, specifically pointed against the people of another sexual orientation, gender, race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, etc. And we look forward to the talk. Afterwards, we can maybe have some Q&A or have it more informal over drinks that the institutions are uniting in inviting you afterwards for light drinks. So we can have a talk on that note afterwards. Welcome. So everybody, give a round of applause to Anda Rottenberg.
Thank you very much, and good evening. We are a big company here for this beautiful weather in Iceland. I'm happy to come here when the weather was pretty nice. I was afraid rainy, dark atmosphere and so on, so I'm very happy to be right now here, but because, yes, the trip was long, prepared for 2 years, but we had the pandemics all over. Do you hear me well? And the lecture will not be about art. I decided to talk about something in the global village that maybe you don't suffer of many of the cases that I try to talk about, but I come from the continental Europe and would like to focus your attention on something that passed through the continent. Nice view, Wyoming, human size town. In December 1998, in Laramie, Wyoming, USA. Okay? Yeah. Oops. Right. It's much better now? Okay, thank you very much. Two young men lured a 22-year-old university student, Matthew Shepard, to a suburban wasteland where they beat him and tortured him. Then they tied him to a fence and left to die. Two murderers belonged to a group that imposed its hegemony on the vast territories of North America, having in fact enslaved and decimated the indigenous population of those lands, Indians, namely. They represented the heterosexual category of WASP, white Protestant Anglo-Saxon. Matthew Shepard was a gay, deviated from the norms that prevailed on the prairies of Wyoming, and may therefore have stirred aggression among the inhabitants of Laramie. Shortly before, two of them attacked the gay guy. The entire country had been shocked by news of another murder. The African-American James Byard Jr. was killed by three white racists in Texas. The two boys from Wyoming may not have found any links between their act of hate and the James Byard Jr. racist case. And they were probably unaware that previously outlawed, that previously outlawed homosexual acts were legalized in their state already in 1977. Soon, both Wyoming and Texas crimes were combined in a single Matthew Shepard and James Byard Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Act. Now, as of 2009, it is developed into the act is developed into the American Hate Act that recognizes the crimes committed on the basis of a person's characteristics of race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, gender and identity, and disability. Legal protection from all kinds of discrimination is now enforced not only in the USA, but has also been introduced in a great many countries worldwide. It does not mean, however, that representatives of LGBTQ+ community can now feel safe across the globe. Homosexual acts are still penalized in 74 countries and territories. The sanctions vary. Death penalty is enforced in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Yemen, Mauritania, Somalia, Uganda, United Arab Emirates, excluding Dubai, and Nigeria. In many other countries, homosexuals risk torture and forced conversion therapies. Penalization on homosexuality was reintroduced to India 2013, Belize 2003, Russia, which inherited relevant regulations from the Soviet Union 1933. In Poland, with the silent approval of the government, LGBTQ+ is publicly condemned by the church and actively persecuted by quasi-fascist gangs. As for the progressive part of the word, in the same 2009, when the above-mentioned act was passed in, as many as 18.5% of attacks recorded in the USA were motivated by the non-heterosexual orientation of the victims. The tradition is stronger than the fresh law paragraphs. Penalizing homosexual relations dates back to ancient Assyria. In our Judeo-Christian culture history, the prohibition of homosexual relations stems from the interpretation of the Bible, of course. In the year 342, the Christian Roman Emperor Flavius Julius Constans passed a law that forbid homosexual contacts, which had previously been accepted in a Greco-Roman world. In 390, Emperor Theodosius threatened homosexuals with death by burning at stake. He was influenced by a reading of St. Augustine, who considered sinful all sexual practices that did not serve procreation, masturbation, homosexual sex, non-procreative sex between heterosexuals, and other kinds of sexual conducts collectively defined as sodomy. Penalization of relation deemed inappropriate was resumed in the defeats suffered by the last Crusades, when following St. Thomas, homosexuality became considered as heresy. And punished accordingly. Accusations and court verdicts concerning homosexuality gained intensity during the era of the Inquisition. It was authorized to method of such punishment by Pope Nicholas V in 1450. Sometimes the cruel death sentence was also practiced in the conquered colonies. Leonardo da Vinci escaped punishment twice just because his denunciator failed to appear at the court. But less cruel persecutions lasted in Europe within the 17th and 18th centuries. Although the French Revolution decriminalized homosexuality by law in 1791, yet other countries failed to follow suit. As we know, Oscar Wilde was imprisoned in England for 2 years between 1895 and 1997. Homosexuality was still not tolerated almost across the whole world in the course of the 20th century. Thus, on the legal basis of the well-known Bismarck paragraph 175, the Nazis imprisoned homosexuals in concentration camps where they were forced to wear pink triangles. But in Europe, not only homosexuals became victims of persecutions. Religious dissidents and witches shared their fate. As for the former, the most numerous group that populated Europe in that era were Jews. The wrath of the people began to turn against them already during the First Crusades. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, Jews were exiled from the most towns, particularly in Germany, and when granted the right to temporarily reside among the Christian population, care was taken to make them stand out with their appearance. Visibility or external recognizability was a major element of the way Jews functioned throughout the Middle Ages. Men were often ordered to wear yellow attires and high pointed hats, which not only marked but also ridiculed them. That is how they are portrayed in some paintings. A yellow overcoat is also worn by Judas in the renowned fresco by Giotto. For color yellow had been associated with treason since as early as 12th century. With time, the symbolic meaning of yellow also began to incorporate shamelessness, and therefore it had to be worn by prostitutes. And since the color often imitated gold in paintings, it closely corresponded to the notion of deceit. Alongside treason and shamelessness, it represented a triad worthy of the greatest contempt. Perhaps that was why the Nazis ordered Jews in some ghettos and camps to wear yellow Star of David or yellow triangles. In the 15th century, the Inquisition blamed Jews for all the misfortunes, above all for causing the then frequent epidemics and hunger. Stakes were set ablaze, and the majority of towns soon adopted the privilege of excluding Jews, privilegium de non tolerandis Judaeorum. That act was not abolished for a long time, only its enforcement was sometimes temporarily suspended. In many countries, Jews could only settle down in a designated places known as oppidum Judaeorum, usually outside the toll gates of the city. This was the origin of ghettos. Later applied also for the black people in the USA. With Jewish communities exiled from the cities, witches began to burn at the stake. Those were mainly women, akin to Hildegard of Bingen, midwives, mystics, and healers who practiced medicine and herbalists throughout the entire Middle Age, until they suddenly became a target of the persecutions. The accusation for the plagues and miseries that befell the local population shifted on them, and their image identification with the Jews had been rooted so strong that after 500 years they are still shown wearing the Jewish hats. Witch hunts lasted from the end of 14th century until the mid of 18th century. They reached their peak in the mid of 15th century when Pope Nicholas V, the same who condemned homosexuals, authorized the Inquisition to tackle all instances of magical practices and witchcraft. The most famed witch hunting manual, Hammer of Witches, penned by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, was published in 1486, first time. According to its authors, witchcraft was practiced primarily by women. Men were said to have been more resistant to Satan's temptation, as Jesus himself was one of them. The authors of Hammer were authorized to pass verdicts concerning witches by the Summis Desiderantes bull issued by Pope Innocent VIII. Thus, the majority of those accused of witchcraft were women. An entire prosecution forensic medical complex was set up for the needs of witch hunting. Some countries allowed to use the torture during the investigation. Denunciations of other suspects by a convicted individual was a sufficient reason to level accusation against them, a practice that became commonplace in courts under authoritarian regimes in the 20th century, especially in Stalin's Soviet Union. Various ordeals were used during trials to determine the guilt of innocence of the accused women, such as water ordeal, tear ordeal, and weight ordeal. Interesting that all those massively distributed illustrations of both the ordeals and trials were very popular, as they presumably supplied the viewers with a special salacious pleasure. Proved guilty, witches were condemned to burning at the stake in continental Europe. Or to gallows in the British Islands and North America. Less severe punishment was also inflicted, such as flogging, exile from one's place of residence, and financial compensation for the alleged victim of sorcery. Only a fraction of all trials ended with acquittal. Researchers discovered that the period between 1450 and 1750 witnessed around 80,000 witchcraft trials in Europe, in which around 35,000 individuals, both women and men, were declared guilty. The record-breaking number of around 50,000 trials took place in the countries belonging to the German Roman Empire: Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, Lorraine, Austria, and Czechia. As it has already been emphasized, witch hunts were usually organized in the territories from which Jews had been exiled and were accused of the same, crimes, bringing up plagues and diseases, poor crops, cataclysm, and general misfortunes. In England and Scotland, such hunts were most frequent in the regions where Catholic groups remained in hiding. Furthermore, the Reformation, particularly the teachings of Luther, strengthened the faith in the presence of Satan in the people's lives. The American cultural anthropologist Marvin Harris noted that the peak of witch hunting coincided with the tide of Christian messianism, targeted against social and economic injustice. Sorcerers, therefore, came in handy as a scapegoat on which to channel the wrath of people. Witchcraft trials allowed for laying the blame for social inequalities on paranormal phenomena. Another factor that testifies to the social and not religious underpinning of such trials was that most of those sentenced to death represented the lower social strata, and most of them were women. Nowadays, the only country where capital punishment can still be inflicted for sorcery is Saudi Arabia. Yet, the hunt goes on, as the writer and scientist Mona Chollet noted in her recent book. It is worth to admit that in 1979, the theater in Osnabrück staged Arthur Miller's The Crucible, along with the projection of the documentary movie from the Bertolt Brecht interrogation held in 1947 by House Un-American Activities Committee that accused him for communist propaganda, but it was, again, the witch hunt. All those victims of the witches' trials found a proper memorial only a decade ago in Norway. Recently, many other historians, writers, and filmmakers took interest in the mechanisms of witch hunting. Those also fascinated Heinrich Himmler, whose office gathered an archive of 3,884 records concerning witchcraft trials from the period between 385 till 1940, from a great many countries across the globe and the whole Europe. Each case was given a separate file, and each town a separate folder. 33,000 files with data were created in total. The documents report on the course of the trials, tortures, and executions. As we can see, Heinrich Himmler, Adolf Hitler, and Reinhard Heydrich did not have to invent anything from scratch and did not care to find the ground for their criminal decisions on the provisions of the German law. As Bertolt Brecht remarked already before the war in his Fear and Misery of the Third Reich, the attitude to law at the time was encapsulated in the motto, Recht ist, was dem deutschen Volk nützt. The law is what serves the German nation. For the good of the German nation, it sufficed to enhance historical practices, both those of scapegoating someone for all the ills of the nation and those related to setting up ghettos and camps. What changed were the methods of extermination, in which a deft use was made of the advanced technology while creatively developing many of its aspects further on. Notably, the T4 euthanasia program that was aimed against the cripples and mentally ill people was initially tested on the members of their own society. No public burning, of course. The initial tool of annihilation was a carbon monoxide. But it proved uneconomical already in 1941. Car exhaust fumes were more cost-effective. Even cheaper were the products of combustion of primitive engines of French and Soviet tanks. Those were used in killings perpetrated at the death camps in Treblinka, Bełżec, and Sobibór, in which more than 1.5 million people were killed within only 2 years, up to 1943. Cyclone B was reserved for camps on the territories of the Reich, as well as for Auschwitz-Birkenau since 1942. Although it was put to an experimental use in Buchenwald already in January or February 1940. It was tested on a group of 250 Romani children, long before the Wannsee document concerning the final solution of the Gypsy questions, January 43, and even before the prior act concerning the Jewish question from January 1942. In reality, the practice of extermination preceded both documents, so their goal was rather to grant legitimacy to the pursued actions and to lend them a legal boost. Committed on September 3, 1941 at Auschwitz, the experimental gassing of 250 Poles and 600 Soviet prisoners of war was against the law of the war. Yet the Soviet Union was not among the signatories of the Geneva Convention, and therefore the captured soldiers of the Red Army could easily be doomed to death by starvation in the course of the further hostilities of the Second World War. Their number is roughly estimated at 3.5 million. Probably no one counted those victims precisely, just as nobody ever came up with an exact count of the residents of East Ukraine starved to death by Stalin in 1932 and 33. Their estimated number is evaluated between 3.5 to 10 million. The Russian act of genocide perpetrated on the state's own citizens therefore lent legitimacy to the enemy later decisions. It was similar with the murder of more than 21,000 Polish citizens officers ordered by Stalin in Katyn in the spring of 1940, which paved the way for German executions in Babi Yar. A location previously designated by the Soviets to secretly annihilate their inner enemies. It is just the numbers that differ, while the method stays the same. Everybody learns from everyone else on the path of the progress. Naturally, the point was that the victims were to blame for all the misfortunes that befell Germany. The above-mentioned luminaries of the Third Reich understood perfectly that they were following a centuries-old religious, cultural, and civilization traditions. Some of them reached back to the biblical tales and were imposed in the past by the highest religious hierarchies and state rulers. Some were introduced by force during the colonization processes. In the course of the history, they all served as an instrument of manipulations that caused mass murders and extermination of the whole nations or selected group of people mentioned in the American Hate Act, representing another race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, gender identity, and even disability. Those European traditions were transferred to the conquered continents, yet the sources of the 20th century racism, anti-Semitism, and intolerance are traced not only to these traditions, but also to the paradigm of science and the notions of progress. The 19th century eugenic theories were quick to be tapped into both politics and medicine, which developed at the political service. The mechanisms of those changes were characterized by Walter Benjamin. The communist politicized art, the fascist aestheticized politics, the eugenicist biologized identity. The politicization of science lent a persuasive force to the language used therein, which was soon absorbed by apparatus of propaganda. On one hand, new notions emerged, such as racial hygiene, human improvement, national healing, regeneration of the nation, while on the other, terms with downright negative designation, dirt, impurity, degeneration, disease. Detaching of the notion of modernity from the notion of fascism or communism did not eliminate the context of the definition of progress, which accommodated various social and genetic engineering projects. Their implementation ushered in the practices of sterilization meant not only to improve the society, but also to enhance the race, both in Europe and North America, and even India, China, and Japan. Sterilization procedures were performed in the USA since as early as 1907. Broad programs in this respect were introduced there in 1927. As late as 1956, they still embraced a total of 27 states. Research reveals that US actively supported the implementation of sterilization laws in the Third Reich. Scientific racism also developed on the very basis of eugenic theories. One and the other, or one within the other, played a role in the Third Reich in the formulation of the Nuremberg laws based on, in general, on the Gregor Mendel's inheritance rules and served in the already mentioned T4 program, which initially embraced individuals with a variety of mental and physical disabilities and were extended later to unproductive elements, handicapped persons, the elderly, and young children. The extermination of Jews, Romani, and Sinti people in the course of the World War II occurred just the continuity of once invented progress. The variation of racism founded on eugenics that developed in the North American continent bore obvious ties to the history of slavery and colonization. Yet both the genocidal practices and the exploitation of the enslaved in medical research and experimentation took place in the African colonies. Let us remember that the first genocide of the 20th century was perpetrated between 1904 and 1908 on the territories of today's Namibia, when the German expedition corps, led by the General Lothar von Trotha, aristocrat, murdered or left to die of starvation the Herero and Nama people. German physicians Eugen Fischer, Fritz Lenz, and Erwin Bauer later conducted racial medical researches on 778 severed heads of the survivors from the two tribes. The heads were used as teaching props in studies devoted to the theory and hygiene of race. They were preserved in showcases and storage rooms for more than 100 years. A less obvious influence was exerted by Belgian eugenicists on the incidents that took place in today's Rwanda in 1994. Drawing on anthropometric measurements of the representatives of Tutsi and Hutu tribes, they extolled the former as superior in racial terms and reduced the Hutu to an inferior level. Many decades later, their conclusions triggered a butterfly effect in the form of yet another genocide that took place in Rwanda. Let us return to Laramie case, followed by the American Hate Act. This legal regulation conveys a powerful message as it puts on the equal footing all the crimes and results from intolerance of the different other. Yet, many of these groups still suffer intolerance in today's world. Religious minorities are still not tolerated in the vast sections of the globe. Women's rights are not respected either. They are obviously no longer burned at the stake, but they continue to be sold, raped, and mutilated. They are forced to give multiple births under the penalty of imprisonment, flogging, or even death, deprived of the right to economic self-sufficiency and to decide about their fate, or even to choose what clothes they wear. The Israeli artist Dani Karavan inscribed the first 19 articles from the German Basic Law on the glass panels along the line of the former Berlin Wall and forming part of the Bundestag edifice. These provisions list all the human rights. The same rights are guaranteed by constitutions of a great many other countries. However, it is much easier to address social frustration and point at the common enemy than to respect those paragraphs. The mechanisms of aggression and scapegoating described by Erich Fromm are still holding strong. In the third decade of the 21st century, we notice the rising wave of people anger all over the world. It may easily be manipulated by the smart new Führers, comrades, party leaders, and state rulers for their economic or political purposes, as Putin currently does in Ukraine. Many reasonable people are standing against these processes, but the minorities were never able to stop Cain committing his crime. It is a bitter conclusion that people, like God in the Bible, always begin to look for Abel when he has already gone. Thank you.